Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session today on why trustees need to think differently about strategy and risk in relation to social investment. My name is Kieran Daly. I'm from Social Investment Scotland. Before we kick off, a bit of housekeeping. So the session today is being recorded. So please feel free to turn your camera off if you don't want to be recorded today. We will go through, the meeting structure will be running from 2 o'clock till approximately 3:30. We'll have opportunities for questions and answers at the point when I bring you in. If you could keep your microphone on mute until the Q&A session, that would be fantastic. Thank you. And if you want to ask a question at the point when I bring you in, if you could use the raise hand function or put a question into the message box and I'll field that for you. So that's all the kind of housekeeping bit. The only thing to say is, well, we've got loads of people on the call today. Great to see you all. If you wouldn't mind putting your name and your organisation into the chat function, and we'll be able to see who's here today. And you might be able to make some links with other people on the call today as well. So great to have you all here today. I will just quickly introduce some of my fellow panel members. So I'll bring in Jason Glass from Camphill, Blair, Drummond. Do you want to say hello, Jason?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. It feels, I always think when you're on these things, it's a bit like when you're calling in for what's it, the annual song contest, Eurovision song contest, you know, the scores from Camphill, Blair, Drummond. But if anyone doesn't know where Camphill, Blair, Drummond is, we've got the privilege of being located right next to the safari park. And to those who know me already, I have the privilege of views across the African plains with lions, zebras and giraffes out today. So when life gets a bit stressful for work, you can just wander out, look across the wall of the gardens, and you've got this majestic view with wild animals. That doesn't have any bearing on what I do at Blair Drummond. I've got the privilege of leading an organisation that supports everyone who's involved to realise their potential. It's one of the things I think which we'll talk about in terms of finance and SIS and their journey we followed with them. But we support primarily people with a learning disability within a community of people who are employed and volunteering. There's about 300 of us in one way or another, some with additional needs, some with employment roles and some volunteers. And yeah, on a day like today, we're better to work than looking across the plains of Africa. So yeah, welcome from Blair Drummond.
Well, I have to say I'm jealous from that introduction. I mean, it's the first time we've been in my office for a while, and we've got a beautiful view of a brick wall, so that's great. I'll introduce my colleague Laura. I'm here as well from OSCR. Laura, hi.
Hi, Kieran. Hello, everyone. It's lovely to be with you all this afternoon, albeit virtually. Now, I can't begin to compete with the view that Jason has, but I do have a very pleasant view of rural Fife here this afternoon, where it's gorgeously sunny, and I'm really hoping that the weather's lovely wherever you are as well. So I'm from the Scottish charity regulator OSCR. I've been at OSCR for 14 years now for my sins, so I must be either doing something right or be a glutton for punishment. I'm not quite sure which of the two it really is. I'm a senior manager at OSCR. That's a position that I've held for quite a long time as well. And I've seen during my time at OSCR an awful lot of charities go through a lot of head scratching, a lot of worry, and a lot of consternation about a lot of the decisions that trustees find themselves having to make. And that's a little bit what we're going to talk about today, about the fact that decision making doesn't need to be frightening, it doesn't need to be scary, and neither does risk management. And I think that's something that often people do get a wee bit worried about. So we're going to try and unpick that a wee bit today and have a bit of discussion around some of that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Laura. And we also have another colleague on the call. So we've got Scott Jeffrey from Johnston, Carmichael, and he's also a ICAS Charities Panel member.
Hi there, everybody. I'm just trying to think about how I can follow the examples of the plains of Africa. Well, I live up in Inverness, and I've just looked out my window and I've seen the Loch Ness Monster. So try proving to me that you haven't. So there you go. But yeah, no, I couldn't quite match with that one. But nice to see everybody. And I'm looking forward to having a wee chat with yourself in a wee while. I'm an audit partner based up in Inverness for Johnston Carmichael, the Chartered Accountants. My role covers the whole of Scotland. And what I do from for both corporate accounts and also charities is one of my main specialist areas that we do. As Kieran quite rightly says, I also sit on the ICAS charity panel. Done that for a good few years now, and that's quite an interesting role because you get an opportunity to sort of see what's coming in the direction for charities and try to help trustees and others, people that are professionals as well in the sector, with guidance and support from both accounting, independent examination and audit aspects of it. So that's interesting. And I also, as an unashamed plug, I also host the annual ICAS charity update course, which we'll do, which is going to be taking place again in November. So if you fancy having a little update, have a look at the ICAS website. I'm sure it'll have details of that soon, if not already there. But looking forward to having a wee chat about some of the finance things you can consider shortly. Thank you.
That's great, and it sounds like a great opportunity to swat up on all things accountancy and finance related to charities. So just to reiterate, we're going to be running up until about 2:55 with some presentations. We'll hear from Laura first, then from Scott, then from Jason. And at that point, we'll take some questions. Please feel free to put some questions into the message box as we go. Please feel free to ask questions. No question is a silly question. And we'd like to encourage some discussion today. And we'll aim to answer them for you. So just to kick off, let me frame, I guess, what we do at Social Investment Scotland and a wee bit of what social investment is. That sounds like a useful place to start, I think. So Social Investment Scotland, we've been around for over 20 years now. And we're an organisation who invests in charities and social enterprises. So typically loans of between £10,000 up to 1.6 million is the biggest investment that we have made before. So we've been around to support social sector organisations, and we've really seen a change, I guess, in the sector in relation to risk appetite, attitudes towards social investment, and also what social investment can be used for. A few years ago, 2017, we set up our sister company called SIS Ventures. And this is an organisation where we can invest in mission-led businesses. So more traditional business models where they're making social impact, and it can be locked into their articles of association. This is more about providing equity into those different models. And it's a smaller part of the business, but just a different part of what we do as an organisation. So, social investment loans, what are they and what do they look like? Well, just to give you a brief kind of overview, a loan can be used for many different purposes. Sometimes we issue loans for cash flow purposes. So, for example, organisations that maybe trade, that want to buy stock and retail it. Quite simple, we can maybe do a small loan of £20,000 or so to provide them with enough capital to buy stock. A bridging loan. So we see this quite often where there's maybe European funding, which may be harder and harder maybe to come by, but looking at things in the future, like maybe the Green Jobs Fund or other funds where you incur costs as an organisation upfront and you get paid retrospectively, we can provide loans which bridge that gap in between the grant and basically you've been paid for that work, and that's usually small short-term loans. Blended loans, these are the most favourite, aren't they? So these are loans where there's a grant and there's a loan mix. Why is that good? Because obviously there's a grant attached to it. And we have products like our SIS Growth Challenge, where we launched that a wee while ago, and we were able to invest in organisations like Locavor, who are now scaling their shops across Scotland. So they're aiming to open up 6. So we were able to offer them £800,000 as a part of a kind of blended loan and grant mix. As an extension to that, we sometimes just issue larger loans to organisations that have a proven track model and are looking to scale across Scotland or further afield. And obviously, quite often, organisations come to us because they want to buy property. And that's a good investment because you've got an asset and you can make that work for you. And most often, if someone's buying a property, we're the junior investor, and the social bank, like maybe Triodos or CAF Bank or another bank like that, is a senior investor, and they rank higher in terms of taking security. Therefore, the interest rate is affected because if you offer security, that can offer also alter interest rates. So that's to set the scene and to give a bit of a kind of overview of what social investment is. I'll now introduce and hand over to my fellow panel members to start the discussion round about trustees' responsibilities, and actually what do you need to consider and what do you need to be aware of in relation to risk around about strategy and social investments. Laura, I'd like to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Kieran. Okay, right, let's have the first test of the day. I'm going to try and get my screen to share here. And I'm hoping that everyone can see the first slide okay. Could someone give me a wee nod if they're able to?
Perfect, Laura.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Thank you so much, Grant. Okay, so what I'm gonna try and do in this kind of short slot is to talk, or start off anyway, talking about what running a charity well actually really means in practice. And then I'm going to hopefully come on to sort of talking and exploring how managing risk really isn't something that's complicated or that should be feared. And I think that's really relevant when we're thinking about social investment, particularly for organizations and charity trustees that might never, ever have really thought about this before. So let's see if we can make a start. If I can get my wee slides to move here. There we go. Okay, Grant. So I'm going to start off then with some good, hopefully practical thoughts about what running a charity well really does mean. I think people are probably quite used to either hearing me or indeed my OSCR colleagues talk about the legal duties of charity trustees, but it's good, I think, to talk about things at a very practical level as well. And of course, there's a really clear link back between the things that I've got here on the slide and actually what the charity trustee duties look like in law. When any of us think about what running a charity really well actually means, I think these are the sorts of things on the slide here that we would all come up with, okay? So having a good, strong understanding of the purposes of the charity and making sure that the charity is actually delivering on those, that for me kind of comes front and center. If you don't get that, you're likely really to be way off beam from the start. So the fundamentals have to come first. And if events or circumstances mean that those purposes are no longer appropriate for the charity or what your beneficiaries really need you to do for them, then of course you can change those purposes. Other things I would pick out here, acting responsibly. Now that may sound pretty obvious, okay, because charity trustees are the guardians of the charity and its assets, and it therefore follows that they need to act responsibly, diligently, and with appropriate care. Help, support, and advice where it's needed is a really key feature here, I think, of what it means to run a charity well. Now, in the time that I've been at OSCR, as I say, over 14 years now, I have seen so many charities struggle with decisions and deliberate over whether they should get some professional advice on a matter. Often my response is that sometimes you really can't afford not to get that appropriate advice. It helps to be really clear as to what you want the advice on and what your expectations are of what that advice is going to help you to do. That will hopefully help you to get the best advice for you and for the situation that you're in. And the final one that I'd sort of pick out here is that running a charity well definitely doesn't mean that you just do the same things that you've always done because that's what's always happened in the past. Whether you've been sitting around that trustee table for 5 years, 10 years, or indeed 5 minutes, don't fall into the trap of doing the same things that the charity's always done just because that's the tradition. Running any organization, whether it's a charity, a commercial business, whatever it might be, means being able to adapt and move with the times. In fact, all of us, I think, over the past year and a bit, have had to adapt to new ways of behaving and new ways of living. And charities have shown themselves to be immensely adaptable in these circumstances. And hopefully that's helped many of them to be able to actually see that there are other ways to conduct business, to make decisions, and indeed to structure their activities. So what that provides us then is with a bit of an overview about how many different elements there are to running a charity really well. Okay, let's just move on briefly to look at the legal duties that trustees have, and then we'll see how those practical aspects that we looked at in the first slide kind of marry up here. The duties that charity trustees have can primarily be broken down into what we call the general duties and the specific duties. The overarching thing to remember for trustees is that they need to act in the interests of the charity, and that's a phrase that you're going to hear me say time and time again, because this is what this is all kind of resting on. It's the key aspect that we're going to focus on today. And in practice, that means that they need to make decisions that are best for the charity, not for them as individual trustees, trustees as a group, a business, a family, whatever it might be. it's about what the charity actually needs. And then we break that down into the component elements, and then that helps us to better understand what it then starts to look like in practice. We talked earlier about the fact that you need to have a clear understanding of and importance of the purpose that the charity actually exists for. That's critical to make sure the charity operates in line with that purpose. And in acting in line with the interests of the charity, trustees have to think about or have to act with what we call due care and diligence. Now, often we find that that's easiest to think of as the standard of care that you would apply if you were dealing with the funds or the business of somebody else. And that's, of course, exactly what charity trustees are doing, because they're dealing with the finances, the assets, and the reputation of the charity. It's the charity's business that they're actually dealing with. So to act with due care and diligence in managing a charity, trustees need to have appropriate information to be able to make sound decisions and to be able to act responsibly. A good example of this that I often see is about finance of the organisation and the financial position of the charity. When charity trustees are trying to make decisions about what money to spend or indeed what money to invest, they need to understand the implications of the choices that they are potentially going to make. They can't simply devolve responsibility for that to maybe just the treasurer or one or two trustees around the table. Everyone around that charity trustee table needs to have at least a basic understanding of the charity's finances so that they can contribute properly to discussions and decisions, because of course the decisions that charity trustees make always are collective decisions. And finally, in terms of these general duties, you've got that duty to manage conflicts of interest that arise between a charity and a person who appoints charity trustees. On top of that, of course, you've got the specific duties that I'm not going to cover in detail today. I've put them on there for completeness. Those of you that are familiar with charity law will know what these are. They're things like the duty to keep good accounting records, the duty to prepare annual accounts, to seek consent, for example, if you want to change the charity's purposes. It's that sort of thing that we're talking about. But bear in mind what I said we were going to try and focus on today is that acting in the interests of the charity aspect. And this is what it keeps coming back to. And I think this has to be one of the most common questions that charity trustees really have, and one that can sometimes result in an awful lot of confusion, argument indeed, and indeed misunderstanding too. But like a lot of big questions, there isn't just one right answer that everyone can learn and then just gaily go off and say, oh, that's fine, we understand that now, we'll just go off and apply that. Sadly, it isn't quite that simple. So here what I've done is to hopefully try and give you a wee bit of a flavour as to what acting in the interests of the charity can actually mean in practice. And essentially what you'll see here is that the answer to the question very much depends on the situation that the charity is in, and that will inevitably change over time, okay? So sometimes it can be about expansion or extension of activity or operations. Conversely, sometimes it can be about contraction for maybe a short period of time or perhaps a longer period of time. But in many ways, I kind of think it comes down to flexibility and adaptability and making the best choice for the situation that the charity is in now, but also thinking about the longer term implications of the choices and the decisions that you make. Okay. So boiling some of that down, what I've done here is to kind of give you in that orange box on the left there are some of the key factors that I think need to be considered when you're trying to think about what acting in the interests of the charity does mean in practice. So again, it's back to the same things we've covered. Purposes, be clear as to what they are. Think about whether they're still appropriate for the charity. Current activities, are they the right ones or the best ones for what your beneficiaries need from you at this time? Or could actually maybe a small or even a bigger change actually make a huge difference to people? Are the current activities sustainable? Or are there other factors maybe likely to impact on the activities that need to be carried out? And then in thinking about the activities that need to be delivered, trustees need to think both about capability and capacity, I think, to deliver those. So for instance, if perhaps activities need to be changed or perhaps diversified, then is the charity currently capable of doing that? Can it staff more activity, for instance? Does it have the expertise to engage in something very different from what it's done up until now? All of those are considerations that you might want to then factor in when you're thinking about maybe changes or decisions you might want to make. And then if you think that change is actually needed, there are further things to consider, and that's what's kind of on that right-hand side, that sort of bluey green box down there. Basics here would be, the first thing has to be about the legalities. Can we actually do this different thing or make this change that we want to make? Have we got the power to do it? You might need to go back to the charity's governing document to understand that, for instance. Next, the question of how to change, I think, is a really key one, and that can involve lots of different areas. So, for instance, a charity might want to consider if it needs to change its legal form or its structure to be able to deliver a different activity or to behave in a different way. If, for instance, the charity wants to employ staff for the first time, but it's currently an unincorporated charity, then the charity might want to consider whether it needs to become a charitable company or a SCIO, a Scottish Charitable Incorporated Organisation. And that would then avoid the charity trustees having to personally become the employers of those staff and to limit their liability. So that might be a key consideration. And there might be many questions that trustees have about what information they need to be able to understand and make the best decision for the charity, a decision that's well reasoned, that's capable of challenge, as well as one that's practical and realistic, not just the kind of idealism. Be realistic and be practical with what you can actually do. And as we discussed earlier, it can be really important to sometimes seek some professional advice when you're trying to make a decision like this, to make sure that there are no unintended consequences that you haven't thought about or maybe haven't explored. Okay. So as the last slide alluded to, sometimes then acting in the interest of the charity means that change is actually required, either in what maybe the charity is doing, how it's acting, how it's set up. And we all know that making changes of any sort can involve risk. And I find that whenever the word risk comes up around the charity trustee table, many charity trustees then almost find themselves slightly paralyzed with fear and uncertainty. They worry that they can't take a risk because they're trusted stewards of the charity and all that the charity has, its assets, its reputation. Sometimes they think that doing something that involves risk can be reckless, or they might be accused of being reckless, or that maybe change can only happen if they can mitigate every single risk down to a negligible level. But the reality, of course, is quite different. All of us in our day-to-day lives deal with risk. You know, we do this every day, quite unconsciously, and we carry on putting one foot in front of the other. So it has to be possible for charities to do the same. And I actually think that, you know, some of the answers here are actually relatively simple. So risk management, for me, is one of those terms that I think people hear a lot and use a great deal, but they don't really understand what it really does mean. Or they think sometimes it's very scientific, it's very complex, it's something that, you know, you have a giant algorithm that works it out for you and bingo, comes out the magic answer at the other end. But actually it's not like that. And really the reality is quite different, and it's certainly a lot less scary, I think, than some people might otherwise imagine. So when I think about what risk management looks like for a charity, I think it's something like what I've got on the slide here. So firstly, it's certainly not about being reckless. Obviously, risk management is about acting responsibly. Firstly, by understanding the risk that the charity maybe faces and the relevant factors involved in the decision it's trying to make, and indeed the potential risks that are involved. Because if you don't understand the decision that you're trying to make and the implications and the risks, then sadly, you're much more likely to make the wrong choice. So understanding what it is that's in front of you that you're trying to make a decision about is the first place to start. And you've got to feel comfortable about that, I think, before you can start to move on. To manage risk, charity trustees need to be, I would say, really well equipped to perform their role as a charity trustee. Training is really important, starting, of course, with good induction when a person first takes on a charity trustee role, but also supporting that by ongoing learning and development, keeping up to date with relevant guidance, for example, that's available, understanding where there are perhaps legal changes that would affect your charity or the activities that your charity engages in. And knowing where to access more information or more support is a really important feature of risk management. And as I say, that includes seeking really specific advice where you actually need it. Proper decisions also need to be taken as to how risks are going to be managed. I think that's the other thing I would point out. It's an active process. It's not one that you can kind of simply say, yeah, we'll hope for the best. That's not going to pan out. We'll not have to worry about that. To bring it kind of back to basics, how many of us would go out for a walk when the sky's dark grey, rain is actually forecast, and we wouldn't at least maybe put on a coat or take an umbrella? You know, that ultimately is risk management without us necessarily kind of badging it as such, but it is true. It's the same kind of principles that we're talking about here. The last thing I would say here is it's really important to be able to explain any decision that's taken, including how risks that are associated with that have been considered and how they've been dealt with. A good test sometimes I find of how robust a decision actually is when you try to explain it to somebody else that's not been involved in it, or when you try and write the decision down along with your supporting reasons. So say you're trying to minute a trustee meeting, it's a good test. If you can't explain it properly, either verbally or in writing, then I think you maybe need to go back and say, have we made the right decision? Have we looked at all the relevant factors here? From a regulator's point of view, we expect charity trustees to act responsibly. Of course, you would expect me to say that, and of course, in line with their duties. But that shouldn't, I fear, be confused with never taking a risk or always opting for the less risky choice. Let me be really clear about that. You know, we're not a regulator in the business of saying to charities, you must never, ever do anything which involves any risk, because life isn't like that. We've got to be realistic about this. When risk management is carried out appropriately, the options are weighed up and a decision is made that can be well reasoned. That's what we expect to see. And often taking something of a risk can actually be imperative to allow trustees to act in the interests of the charity. I think that's a really important point to bear in mind as well. So just trying to wrap up now then. Putting that into context then of thinking about social investment decisions, what I've outlined here are some really sort of key aspects or key factors to think about, either when you're deciding whether to make a social investment or maybe to receive one, because of course charities can be in both situations here. And you'll see that the factors that I've kind of outlined here, they're all about understanding the decision that you're facing, the implications for the charity, and the impact both short and longer term. And my fellow panelists will indeed in a moment start to build on some of the principles that I've covered here to let you see a wee bit more about what this really does mean in practice. So just before I hand over to Scott, what I've given you on the slide here are just a few kind of links to guidance publications, or a few headings of guidance publications that you'll find on the OSCR website if you want to do a bit more reading or have these as a point of reference. The Being a Charity in Scotland guide has got information about trustee duties in quite short form. And my personal favourite is the very back page of that publication, which has got top 10 tips. If you print out nothing else off the OSCR website, print out the top 10 tips and stick it on a notice board somewhere. You could do a lot worse than try and follow those. But there's also guidance, kind of longer form guidance there and good practice for charity trustees, as well as more detailed stuff about charities and investments and indeed charities and trading. And we're going to update our trading guide just very shortly. So if it's something that you're interested in, keep a little lookout on the OSCR website for an update coming on that one. So Scott, forgive me, I think I've overrun by a few minutes eating into your time. Thank you folks very much. And I'll look forward to kind of engaging in the Q&A later on. Okay, thanks.
That's great. Thank you, Laura. That's really helpful. I'll just start trying to take over the sharing of the screen. And bear with me, everybody, please. Just need to a few more clicks to go, and we'll be in business. Hopefully. And then now, Kieran, is that looking okay?
Absolutely perfect.
Perfect. That is great news. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for the opportunity to have a wee chat with yourself on this. This has been like an 18 months that we've never had. We've all been through quite an amazingly hard and challenging times in all different ways. But hopefully we're starting to see the opportunities and seeing some positive signs out there. And it's with that sort of mindset that I'm going to be talking to you today. Just some of the experiences that I've had over the 25 years in the profession, but also focused on the last 18 months and some of the things from the finance side of things, which from best practice point of view have found to be good for those that have already been doing it, and those that haven't been doing it, what they could and have had to move towards. So at the end of it, clearly welcome to take your questions on it. So just a few points for an agenda to talk through. Back to basics is the first bit. Then taking ownership of your figures, and then assessing the options, and then a wee sum up at the end. So back to basics. What am I meaning with that? Well, it's quite simple, really. It's about being able to make informed financial decisions now or to do with the future. Starts with having up-to-date, accurate financial information. So it's the old cliche of rubbish in, rubbish out, and I see that quite often, whereby, or have done in the past as well, whereby the accounting focus is maybe not as strong as it should be, the data entry is maybe not as accurate as it could be, and then they're left with these financial information, and they're trying to make judgments and assessments on this, and actually it's not complete. So my question to you, if you're involved in the charity and you're involved, whether a trustee or in the finance side of it or whatever it may be, is this sort of quick test for yourself as to how good are your records? So everybody in Scotland has got to do either an audit or an independent examination, depending on your size and requirements. How long would you have to give it after your year end before you could go, do you know what, I'm ready to hand those records in, we can get on with this audit, or we can get on with this independent examination, because I'm happy that our records are in pretty decent shape? Now, that's a very quick snapshot view as to how good are they? Because if you're able to say, oh, I can turn it around probably within the month after year end, or there or thereabouts, maybe a couple of months, because there's always something else to be doing, or maybe you want to catch in some late invoices, etc., then clearly that's probably looking in pretty decent shape. If you're saying it's taking, I won't be ready for the 6 months or 7 months, that's questionable as to why. And you have to ask yourself that. The other question is, if you're getting your accounts back and year on year, you're getting lots of adjustments from your professional advisor, from your accountant or whatever, again, it suggests to me that the accuracy of what you've got in the accounts in the first place is not quite as good as it could be. So how can you possibly be able to make any informed decisions about the here and now and also the future without having that accurate information? So sit back, ask yourself who's responsible for overseeing the financial information and how informed are the trustees on such matters. Now, I'm going to pick up again on that in a wee bit later on, but I think it's really important because it's an area whereby I see it time and time again. I think Laura alluded to it a wee bit earlier as well, whereby trustees sometimes go, oh, I don't know anything about finance, it's not my area, and you almost put up the walls and go, but little Joe over there or Katie over there, they do the finance. Well, we'll come back to that shortly. So back to basics, ask yourself the following. Do you know what the charity's reserve policy actually is? More importantly, is it fit for purpose? And goodness, we've seen real challenges on that recently. So the old favourite, which we see in so many sets of accounts historically, was the reserve policy is to have 3 months worth of expenditure, unrestricted expenditure, held as reserve. Some have it, some haven't. But that has been found wanting in a lot of occasions. Nobody could have seen the pandemic that came. Nobody could have seen what the consequences of that are. So sit back and think to yourself, is the current reserves policy we've got fit for purpose? Do you as trustees and in the finance team fully understand the distinction between restricted, unrestricted and designated funds? As a reminder very quickly, restricted are very much a case of this given funding for a particular purpose. Unrestricted, you can do pretty much as what you like within the grounds of the charity objects. Designated is you as trustees decide to designate it for a certain purpose. But one area that's not so well known is what are your free reserves? People get a bit confused on that. And a reminder that free reserves are take aside the restricted funds and anything that's been tied in, like endowments aside, put aside anything that's fixed assets wise that's tied into your unrestricted, because again, that you can't realize your fixed asset property very quickly. And also any money that you've designated and said, I'm going to be doing it for that particular project, put that aside. And that's you starting to get a feel for what your real reserves are that you've got for that rainy day moment. And are they enough? And that's the question you need to be asking yourself on. And again, Laura touched on this one. When was the last time the trustees reviewed the objects of the charity? Now, again, there's always that risk of like creeping roles and duties and plans and great ideas, but does it actually meet the charitable objectives? So always take a step back and think to yourself, are we okay to be doing plan A, and will that meet with our objects, or are we starting to walk down a different path that could get us into a wee bit of trouble from the object compliance perspective? Strategic plans. Now, yeah, you're a charity. Doesn't mean you shouldn't have a strategic plan. And also, ensuring that the financials stack up to a potential investor and lender. I'll come back to that shortly again. And a very simple question, really, but do you actually know how much money you need and for what the purpose is? Or do you have a feel for it? Or actually, do you have something a bit more tangible than that? Quite amazing number of times people go in and they go, oh, I think I probably need about whatever, 50,000. And actually, that may or may not be the case. They need a bit more accurate information. At our firm, Johnston Carmichael, one of our core values is the importance of standing in other people's shoes. And my recommendation is for you to do exactly that if you're in this situation and seeking finance from a third party. Sit back, ask yourself, why should they lend you the money? Why should they? Is your strategy clear and with a purpose? Is it easily understood? Can we demonstrate that we have the ability to service this debt, not just in the good times and not when you've got a few quid in the bank, but when the challenges arise? And goodness, we've all seen plenty of those in the last 18 months. And can you provide up-to-date financial information, not just the historic financial accounts? Now, I say I'm very much involved in preparing sets of accounts and auditing the sets of accounts and various things like that. But the reality is that's historic information. And most banks and lenders and anybody wanting to invest any money into something tend to want to know what's happening now and the financial situation today, because goodness, a lot can happen in a month or two, never mind in a year. And also not just about the here and now, they want to look about the future. And we'll be touching on that again shortly as well. So moving on to the topic of taking ownership. And again, I think Laura touched a wee bit on this as well, about the importance of understanding that different charity structures have different legal obligations on the trustees. And I think it's fair to say that not all trustees really are aware at the time they agree to becoming a trustee, what the potential implications are of doing that on day one. Best example being that if you're an unincorporated charity, then you technically have unlimited liability. That's the whole one of the benefits of going down and having a corporate charity or a SKIO for that matter. They have those things. Clearly, if it's fraud or something like that, then all bets are off. But when it comes to just the normal everyday running of a charity and done in best practice, in good faith, you do have this risk of an unlimited liability with unincorporated charities. So just think to yourself what that means. That if the charity was into default with the debts and aren't able to pay, and you're in that kind of nature of a charity, that kind of structure, could that fall on you? Is your house at risk? These are the questions that you need to be asking yourself. Taking legal advice as well, because to be honest with you, this is not just all about accounting. Some of this does cross across the legal profession as well. I think there's one or two legal professionals, like one of my panel members might be on this call today. So please, don't be frightened to speak and ask for the right advice on these kind of things. But also, is there sufficient knowledge of financial matters within the trustees? And that's the point I was making earlier on. I've seen it many times before that the one person goes, oh, that's all been done by the finance person. There is collective responsibility. A decision by a trustee is taken on behalf of all trustees. And if you decide to wash your hands of not really wanting to know the detail, then you're going to be opening yourself up to whatever that other trustee has signed you up on your behalf. So I say, take an interest here. They leave, then what? As well as the other thing. And where's the challenge? If one finance person is doing everything, there is an enhanced risk. It was undoubtedly the case. And if there isn't the necessary skills, and again, I do know Laura touched on this, this is not just me flying the flag for the profession and wanting more fees, but the reality is that if you don't have the expertise and skills on your board of trustees, you should go and seek to try to get that expertise on the board of trustees. And if you can't get the expertise on the board of trustees, then go and seek the right professional advice and pay for it, because it is money well spent sometimes. I like to say all the time, but I'll say sometimes, where actually the decision is to either sail blindly into the sunset or actually get the advice in some areas which really you need to have. So that would be my thoughts on that. Again, back to that financial information, what's required. So worth thinking about, and the different firms, so using a reputable firm to undertake an audit under independent examination can have its advantages when taking your proposition to a third party. It's undoubtedly the case that we see it in many times in business as well as charities. But if our firm, it doesn't have to be our firm, but other reputable firms have prepared the projections, etc., then that does add an element of credibility, because they know they'll have been subject to a due challenge at that stage. So when it goes to the bank or the funder, they have that little bit more comfort than it had just been prepared by the charity themselves. Internally, my advice would be, depending on your size, criteria, etc., prepare monthly or possibly at most quarterly management accounts with commentary. Get a feel for the results as it's happening. Don't just leave it to year end. Make sure you've got a feel for it. Is the information accurate? And you'll be able to, and then having that commentary to explain variances between one quarter and another. And as I say there, if you can't do the financial projections yourselves, you don't have the background experience, get the professional advisor to help with them. Third parties expect you to have credible financial projections. And in all fairness, so should the trustees as a matter of good governance. You have a duty to make sure that you're looking after and protecting the assets, and having credible financial projections looking ahead is one way of doing that. What do credible financial projections mean in reality? Well, looking at least 12 months ahead on a rolling basis. It has to be a live document as well, not done once and then stuck in a drawer. I mean, that's absolutely pointless. What I do hear, or have heard at the start, and still hear actually, in all fairness, sometimes people say that, oh, the current situation is too difficult to do projections. There's too much uncertainty. I can't possibly know with any certainty what the future holds. So I'm not doing them. Well, that's not an answer. It literally is the ostrich mentality of sticking your head in the sand and going, I can't decide which way it's going, so I'm just going to look down and hope for the best. You know, in these scenarios, you should be saying, okay, there is challenges, there is uncertainties. I'm going to do multiple alternatives. So you do a worst case scenario of if suddenly lockdown happens again, if all your income sources dry up, there's no furlough. What does this mean? How long can you survive for? A base case is kind of like, well, this is what we think is going to happen based on everything we've got. And they've also got a best case. We're going to know what, it might even be better than we could possibly hope. As for some businesses, they've started a lot better and stronger now than they would ever have dreamt in the original projections from last year, charities being the same. So what I'm saying is rather than just sticking your head in the sand and saying it's all too difficult, sit back and go, do you know what, we need to think of different alternatives. And then nobody's got a crystal ball, but you think about the what if scenarios. And you think to yourself, what if people are off sick and can't work and go on to have to self-isolate? What if we have to shut due to restrictions? Whatever it may be, these have to be built into your projections, and that in itself adds credibility to them when you're coming to a new future funder, because you take your projections along, but also along with that you take your assumptions and lets them shows them the thinking you've had. Last year, for some charities particularly, preparing financial projections for the first time will have been required. And it's all part of the going concern assessment, because every charity, every business has to make an assessment as to going concern. Going concern being that you are assuming and assessing that you are going to be in operations and business for at least 12 months from the date the accounts are signed off. It is not 12 months from the year-end date. And that's why the point I make at the very top there about having credible financial projections looking at least 12 months ahead on a rolling basis is key. So if your year-end is the 31st of March, as many people are, but we're now coming towards the end of August, if you're doing projections now, you need to be looking and thinking to yourself, what are we going to be financially, cash flow-wise, through to at least August 22, not just to March 22. Yeah, and that's really important. Yeah, so I touched on some of these points already. Future funders, lenders, ongoing monitoring of financial performance is essential. So it's not just, I say, not just park it in a drawer. You need to keep it live, keep it a fresh set of projections, and revisiting it on a regular basis. Preparing your monthly management accounts, but quarterly management accounts, but also comparing how is your performance doing against your budget. As I say, there's nobody got a crystal ball, so there will be ups, there will be downs, but are you online, and what needs to change in line with your expectations? So you're comparing your financial projections against the budgets versus reality. You're going to compare against your prior year results, albeit last year's results might be a particularly bad year. So again, you have to understand that and explain that. But also sitting back and going, well, you know, in relation to cash flow is a little bit tighter in these particular areas. You need to know your pinch points. And sometimes for some people, there may be back quarters. It might be a particular capital project. You've still got payment bills to pay out. It could be because you're a charity and it's seasonal. And therefore, suddenly, if a caravan park, for example, and then come November, December time, you're shut and there's no income coming in unless you're getting deposits or something. So you have to understand your pinch points. You have to understand where your risks are, and monitor and think to yourself, well, what do we need to do to get the cash in to cover that? Also, the point I'm making there about authorizing expenditure. Who's doing that? Who's got the controls of that? A simple one. What's your credit terms? So if you're giving your customers credit at all, and they've got debtors days, but you're also paying your suppliers. If you're paying your suppliers quicker than you're getting the money in, you've got a cash flow issue. If it's the other way around, then good on you. You're managing to pay your suppliers a little bit later than the money coming in. Of course, if it's Johnston Carmichael, please pay us as quickly as you can. That's always goes down well. But you get the idea. So expect to have to comply with financial covenants as well. So borrowing will most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, come with some element of financial covenants. So be mindful that they're there to be followed and complied with. If you do breach them, you could be in default, and that could be a serious problem. A couple of final points on these bits of taking ownership. File your accounts and annual returns with OSCR on time. Now, I know over the last year, there's been a bit more of an excuse accepted, and many a charity and many a business has used it and had to use it, and that's fine. It was there because of COVID-19. There was various different delays. Finance teams furloughed, etc. They couldn't deliver within the 9-month reporting deadline, which for a lot of people in business got extended by another 3 months. For charities in Scotland, you actually got given up to potentially 9 months, but some actually 9 months, but the rules have kind of changed. Now, I know to companies you can still seek an extension. I'm sure OSCR would be willing to have conversations if you're really in that boat. But late accounts are not ideal, and under normal circumstances, you do get a black mark on your particularly on Charity Commission or OSCR. It's very visible. They did manage, I believe, to take it out for that year of COVID so that people don't see that. But generally speaking, you will. And what kind of message does that send to third parties and funders that you can't get your accounts in time? So please take on board that point. Assessing the options. So yeah, we've touched on some of these before through the various different comments we've had from Kieran, etc. as well. There's loans. You've got to consider the interest rates and repayment terms. What's affordable ultimately? I've got charities whereby they borrow from people with a specific interest in the charity. So sometimes that can be more favourable because they're actually maybe not wanting any interest charges or whatever it may be. There's the hybrid loan and grant arrangement, which Kieran mentioned, which is quite a popular one. There could be other things like actually doing a trading subsidiary. So again, charities quite often go, I can't do trading because it's against my charitable objects and it's taxable, etc., etc. Well, yes, trading, if it's depending on what the trading is, can be taxable. But if you actually create your group structure in an appropriate way by having a trading subsidiary underneath, which then gift aids up the taxable profits up, then actually it can be a pretty tax efficient way of doing it and still allow you, like for example, to run a cafe or a restaurant with the sole purpose of actually raising money for the charity, which then effectively goes up. So things like that. And investments, some charities are extremely cash rich. For many that maybe sometimes struggle, there's others that are actually really, really wealthy. But then you think to yourself, well, with the low interest rates in the bank accounts just now, well, what am I doing with that? You've got a duty as trustees to actually consider these things and think to yourself, should I be putting it in the bank and keeping it safe in the bank, or as safe as you can be in there? Or should I be thinking of investing it? And if you're investing it, well, what's your risk profile for that? Do you have to think that? So again, these are the things that can generate you more money, but they all come with some element of risk all along their profile. So my point here is documentation, and that's my message here, is documentation, please. Document the documentation of the trustees' decisions are essential for good governance. Make sure that you've got the backup explaining what assumptions you've made, etc. Because ultimately then, if you make your assumptions in a year's time, you can go back to it and refer to it if anybody wants it, to put it in board minutes. So in summary, good financial controls helps deliver good financial and timely information, which enhances good management decision-making, which is at the heart of good governance. So ultimately, before seeking new funding, go back to yourselves and go, what is it actually we're wanting? Do we actually know what we want to achieve, and what do we need to borrow? Ask yourself, is it in the best interest of the charity? Do we need to take this additional debt? What are the consequences of it? Prepare robust financial budgets and projections, noting the assumptions and different sensitizing of the numbers. And my final point there is duty on trustees to protect and safeguard the assets. However, risk management designed to eliminate all risk, you can't. All you can do is look to mitigate against the risks. So by doing that and best practice, then hopefully you're going to be in as best a place you possibly can. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing. Okay.
Thank you, Scott. That's perfect.
No problem at all.
Hi there, Jason. Let's bring you in.
Okay, let's share the screen. Okay, I think that's working for everybody. Kieran.
Perfect.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Scott, for that. So I've been set the responsibility of trying to give a beginning towards the end of a journey that we've had with CIS, and through the various correspondence we've had, it was to look at social investment and the market. And it's quite interesting, the sort of journey we've had. And what I'm going to do is start off and just give you a little bit of a potted history of how we went about raising finance, both loan and grants, nearly 14 years ago, and how we're coming towards the end of that financial commitment with Social Investment Scotland, which will be next year, which is quite remarkable. So yeah, here's a little picture of one of our buildings. It's quite grand. It's hard to believe that people used to live in houses like this. But when I first arrived at Blair, Drummond, the Mansion House, you see, was the organisation, the community. But what we've done is embarked on an ambitious capital development plan. And if you look just to the left, you see this house here, which I'm circling. This is the house that, I was going to say that Jack built, but this is the house that CIS helped us build nearly 10 years ago. But I'm going to start off with, I suppose what's been touched on by Laura and Scott is the whole sense of purpose of our organisation. So when I arrived 14 years ago, the place looked a bit tired. It was on its knees a little bit. There was very little money in the bank. In fact, there was very little to pay the bills. I had not long been here, and it was a juggle to pay the salary bill every month. What bills can we put off to pay? We need to pay the employees. How are we going to manage the fees are not enough to pay the running of the organisation? Many challenges, but I saw that as a great thrill and an opportunity. But really, at the heart of our organisation, I just thought I'd set this off, is the sense of purpose of why we exist. And it's about creating community, but within it, that sense of social renewal. And it's providing a place where everybody has a sense of integrity and dignity and a sense of self-worth and a role irrespective of need. The photograph we've got here is one of the people with additional needs we support, and one of our international volunteers who comes and lives with us for a year, which is part of an experience of traveling around the world. It's otherwise a gap year, but they come and live and share life with us. And through that, they hopefully have their own sense of renewal and growth and confidence and ability, and they learn and grow with the people alongside them. And that's what we've got really, is everybody contributes as equals. And it really is true. It's everybody from our board of trustees, who are not some distant group of people who sit in a boardroom and now and again pop in. They're very much here for this sense of their own growth and potential. And we use this strapline that we work together, learn together, and ultimately grow together as a community and as individuals. And that's remained true right throughout the last 14 years. And for me, what was really exciting about joining 14 years ago was this has been true right from the beginning of the formation of Camphill Blair Drummond in 1974, and also the Camphill movement in Aberdeen during World War II from some Austrian Jews who were fleeing Nazi Germany. And it exists as much today as it did then. So the journey with CIS. When I joined, we set out with this realization we wanted to invest £10 million in a capital development plan. And we developed a business plan and an appeal fundraising plan. Now, £10 million, just to give you context, we had £1 million income then per year with a number of years of deficits and without basically any money in the bank. But at that point, we realized that that sense of purpose of the organization was very much something that people underestimated and didn't understand. And what they saw was the big Victorian house, a bit of an institution, and an organization that was a little bit on its knees. So we set out on this journey of organizational transformation and looking at how do we sustain ourselves. Now, at the time, there was about 102 people involved with the organization, relatively small, but immediately we needed to introduce some financial discipline. Now, that's quite interesting because a lot of charities I've worked with, and particularly this one when I arrived, I think sometimes people think money grows on trees. And when I arrived, I came from a commercial background. And I remember some conversations with people saying, Jason, for you, it's just all about money. That's all you talk about, all about money. But I felt, and the Board of Trustees felt at that time, if we didn't get the financial discipline right, we had no hope of ever turning the organisation round. And there was no way we're ever going to get any investment and or grants. And I remember challenging some people saying, well, if it's not all about money, I'm happy for you to volunteer here, and we don't need to pay your wages next month. And those individuals, I don't know about that, we need to be paid. Well, yes, so it is about money. We need to get the business right, and then get the business right, we can help fulfill the potential of the organisation. So as we set out on this journey, £10 million, people sort of laughed at us a bit. Yeah, you've talked about it for years as an organisation. It's never going to happen. But with a bit of financial discipline and some order, as Scott has said, looking at our projections, understanding how much money we had, what we needed it for, and an element of due diligence where we involved professional advice. Really difficult, you've got no money, but actually we need to pay for some professional advice and support. And as a result of that, our journey with CIS started back in 2009. It's quite unbelievable. And at the time, we would love someone to write us a cheque for £10 million. Wouldn't anybody? £10 million, and then you can spend it as you wish. But actually, the whole exercise at the beginning of saying, well, okay, why do we need this money? How are we going to use it? And what are we going to use it for? Really created a sense of clear direction and a sense of strategic plan. Now, this was really difficult because in a community, people had come here to share life and contribute, and money really wasn't at the forefront. As trustees, the board had changed, and there was a number of new people who had joined our board of trustees. And there was a nervousness around because everybody wanted the cheque for £10 million. But actually, if you're an organisation that's been making deficits for a few years, you've got £1 million income, you want to raise 10 million, you've got vacancies, you're not necessarily have the best reputation in the market. How are you going to take on loan finance? Never mind how you're going to get people to donate. But as I said, getting our financial records in place and making sure that everybody who was getting involved with Camphill Blair Drummond understood why we existed, how we planned to spend the money, and what that money would be used for. We were successful in securing, in 2011, £1 million of CIS loan funding. It was 50-50 split. It was a little bit of a disappointment at the time because when we first applied to CIS, we were hoping for 750 grant and 250 loan. But because of some of our many operational challenges, there was an allegation at the time, it got in the media. By the time we went back to CIS again in 2010 it would be by then, the split had reduced. And I remember feeling that sense of frustration and disappointment. But actually looking back, I think it really helped force us to be even more alert to that financial discipline. And I'm going to use this throughout because it's made us smarter, it's made us more efficient, it's made us more effective. And as a consequence, we've been able to raise all the money and more than we envisaged. So as a consequence of getting this money, the other thing that we found is that because we've gone through this very robust process with professionals and with our investors being CIS, it was so much easier to work with grant funders because in a way we'd built the reputation up. We had the credibility because we've got an organisation that's well respected, who've clearly done their work and have made a decision to invest in us at a point when the organisation was just on the precipice of do we continue or do we close. Some of the major grant funders were very receptive and understood and started to support us with grant funding. And so over the next few years, up to 2015, we secured in the region of about another £2 to £3 million of grant funding. And as a result, our business started to grow. We started to generate surpluses, our reputation improved, and we were in a position in 2015 where we could, for the first time, actually go to the market and secure finance. Now that's tempting, but we were able to give security. The business had become more robust, and therefore we were able to secure finance at a lower interest rate than Social Investment Scotland. But we were quite open about that with them, I believe, if we look back. And I felt, and CIS felt, that that was the success. CIS invested with us, and as a consequence of the business realizing its potential, we could start to then borrow money on the open market, which was quite a transformation from 2008, where there's no hope in hell of ever being able to borrow any money. So as the journey continued, it's been really interesting working with CIS because, I think Scott said earlier on about your monthly management accounts, your quarterly reports with detail. We've certainly provided that on an ongoing basis, and the fact that we have to report each quarter has forced us to maintain that financial discipline. I'm not saying you wouldn't have that if you had grant funding, but it's easier when you've got the money in the bank to think about how you spend it. But when you've got the money and you've got to report on that, it does force you to be very disciplined. But as a consequence of that, we continue to be ambitious and start to celebrate our success. So bringing us forward to 2019, we've continued the journey with CIS at a distance with reporting, but also engaging with them because they've been an investor in us and our organisation, and they've been partners throughout that whole journey, sharing in success, but also recognising many of the operational challenges we've had. Having worked in many years in social care, one of the great challenges dealing with complaints or dare say even allegations or a changing market. But keeping a very close relationship with CIS and also recognising that we've got that ongoing financial discipline, which has allowed us to negotiate improved fees with our local authorities. And therefore we start to create this shared passion and vision and purpose where our investors are not just CIS or grant makers or individual donors, but they also become our social care partners, local authorities, who recognise what we're trying to achieve and want us to succeed. As a consequence, there's this belief that it can be done. And so by 2019, we started to move towards the final phases of our capital development plan. And we started to then look at the organisation's ongoing transformation. So we've achieved one element of new build, growing the business, etc. But we then wanted to move on and recognise that because we've achieved that first phase of development, how do you move on to the next phase? So by 2021, we set out to raise 10 million, and actually so far we've raised 11 million pounds. And the business has grown to just under a 5 million annual income. There's now 300 people involved in our community. And rather than a transformation of an organisation, we're starting to look at organisational change, making sure we've got the right people in the right roles, delivering the right outcomes, and starting to explore new social enterprises, which is meaning we're starting to look at how do we raise further funds. So we can go to the bank or we can go to funders. And we don't envisage at the moment having the need to ask for investment from CIS. Now, that to me is a success story because we've secured our future. There's an ongoing confidence and belief in who we are. We have the same purpose, but we've just started to develop a new vision where we recognise new possibilities. And it's interesting because for the last 18 months in a care situation, the way we've had to operate is very much a sort of command and control. However, as we start to come out of the pandemic in one form or other, it's quite remarkable that the organisation has this massive potential. And that's where we start to look at, well, how do we ensure we've got right people, right places, delivering the right roles? And how do we realise the new possibilities? Rather than we reach this plateau of, haven't we done well? We've raised 11 million pounds, we've got all our new buildings, and let's sit back and enjoy. What's really exciting about the organisation now is that initial investment 11 years ago of £1 million has helped realise funding of a further 10, and also taking the business from £1 million to 5, and then at the same time helped us realise that purpose, which is realising the potential of the people we support and care for. So we've got 9 months to go, and the question we've got, what's the next chapter with CIS? As I said earlier on, it's not likely to be them investing in us, and they've helped us realise that potential. but we will be looking at other investors in terms of people's time, support, financial giving potentially for future projects. We've got ideas for a sports and health and wellbeing centre on site being built. But I think the key thing is that our organisation has been secured. We've sustained the purpose, and we're now in a position where we can start to really realise the potential of everybody, and actually recognise that we're in a position of financial strength, stability, and with an organisation of people who are ambitious and excited for the future. So that's a quick idea of where we are with Camphill, Blair, Drummond. Those who know me probably, I could talk for hours about the place. But what I would say, it's a place to come and visit. Once you've visited, it will change your life. You will start to see what can be realised with people, where there's an absolute intention to support everyone as equals.
Thank you very much, Jason, and thanks to all of the speakers on the panel today. So you've got the option to ask some questions through the chat function and or put your hand up to ask some questions through here. Just before we do that, I'm going to do a bit of a plug for some of the support options we have at Social Investment Scotland. So Jason mentioned some of the support from the relationship managers that we have, and we have Harry on the call today, who's one of them. We also run, as part of our market building work, various different programmes to support organisations and leaders to scale and to make the right social investment options. One of them is a business support programme that we're running at the moment, which offers up to 4 days support to organisations, from an associate to work with the leaders of an organisation to work through whatever requirements they have to get their organisations fit for purpose to consider social investment. So there's a link here if you are interested in getting that support, or indeed speaking to us about any social investment options, you can click there. We've got a question. Could we hear a little bit more about the advantages of a trading subsidiary from Scott, please? So you spoke before, Scott, about a trading subsidiary and thinking about obviously risk and how both entities might work together. What are the benefits beyond, I guess, risk of having a trading subsidiary, and how much admin or support might they take to run?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen quite a lot of charities now going down the route of having a trading subsidiary. It seems quite a popular way to do it. I mean, one of the main advantages is clearly the fact it's the tax side of things, because charities have got to protect their own objects. So that's number one. They've got to make sure they're not delving into sort of non-charitable objects. But even you are allowed to do some trading, and there's different things. I won't get into the depths of it, but it's called primary purpose trading. There's auxiliary trading and various different types. If you go on Google that, or even go on OSCR website, I think there's some good guidance on that. But if you want to take out, if it's pretty clear that it's not really within the objects, it's actually a trading routes that you're planning to do. And an example I gave was a restaurant. Another one I can think of is a trading shop. I've seen that before as well. You set up the trading subsidiary. Normally we'd have it as a separate board. Always recommended to have that for its own sort of independence aspect of it. But ultimately, it will be owned by the charity itself, and therefore, when the profits are made, hopefully the profits are made by the trading subsidiary, rather than paying to corporation tax, they are able to take what's called gift aid relief, and they gift aid up the profits to the subsidiary, to the charity above, the charity parent, and they get the benefit therefore of the profits that have been made, and there's no corporation tax or minimal corporation tax to pay. So there's the real benefit there from that. You do have to watch, because some of the areas that can happen is while a trading subsidiary is getting set up, they may be a little bit reliant financially on the parent charity, and that sometimes can get a little bit sticky, because the parent charity shouldn't necessarily be lending money which it might not end up getting back. But if it's given in the short term with a plan to turn it around and get the money back, then it should be okay. But this is back to my point. Documentation is key, because ultimately any decisions that's made, if you have it documented down as to why you're doing it, how you've considered all the different options, why you've considered this to be the best one, you're approving some funding short term to get that subsidiary up and running, but a plan to get it back, etc., then that will stand you in good stead. And I'm sure Laura would sort of vouch for that from an OSCR perspective. Having a trail of trustees' decision making certainly makes the process a lot easier if they're ever having to explain themselves.
And as someone who's set up a trading subsidiary, thinking about different things that we had to consider. So if you're a charity, you don't pay VAT. Is that true or is it not true?
No, it's not correct.
Yeah.
And actually, you're not the first person this week that said that to me. It's a common misconception that charities can be VATable.
Yeah.
If it all comes down to what the income is, and that's actually a bit of a plug as well. To be truthful, if you haven't had a VAT review for a while, there's something that is money well spent. Is get your professional advisors to, maybe, as long as they're VAT specialists themselves, have a little look over what income streams you've got. Because if you're doing different income streams now, maybe changed from 5 years ago, things you might have fallen into the realms of needing to be VATable. So the answer to that is no, you can be VATable even at charity level. But anyways, back to your question.
One more question as well on, I guess more of a kind of point. So you spoke about at points where it's worthwhile paying to get some professional advice. So some of those times might be that actually, if you've got a board of directors and you've got a treasurer, but not necessarily someone that's got financial skills within the organisation, like a financial director, that could be an occasion when it's worthwhile to pay someone to provide that function. Also, if you're thinking about setting up a trading subsidiary, as a board of trustees, you might want to think about consulting with a lawyer or with an accountant to say, give me a letter, which and pay for a letter that says your assessment of this situation is that this trading subsidiary could be set up, and here are the considerations about corporation tax, VAT, etc. That could be a good instance to ask for some advice.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of occasions whereby getting the right professional advice at the right time plays its part. Whether it's from getting the right structure, as I say, whether you're maybe thinking about changing from maybe an unincorporated to a corporate as to what works for them, and whether you're talking about creating a group structure, whether you're wanting advice from, not all charities. I mean, sometimes you'll get a call on HMRC asking you to do corporation tax returns, etc. Again, people will think, oh, I'm a charity, I don't pay corporation tax. No, it doesn't work that way. It depends, again, what they are doing income-wise and the situations like that. So, there is times whereby, and also you mentioned about the lawyers, absolutely. I mean, for example, on the setups of these things, advising on trustees' responsibilities, etc. That's where they come into their own as well. So, but you're right. What is advisable from my perspective would be find yourself dedicated specialists in the charity and not-for-profit world. So not every lawyer and not every accountant know much. They'll maybe pretend they do, but the reality is that they don't. So find out and maybe do a wee bit of research yourself as to who's got the reputation for that. And I would say that'd be good advice.
So I'd encourage more questions from the floor by putting your hand up and or putting them into the box, or I'll continue to ask some more questions. Question, I guess, open to both Laura and to Jason. So Jason, from your point of view, I'm a director of a few smaller charities and social enterprises, and actually it's different being on the point of view where I've had maybe a chief exec come and say, I want to think about social investment. And actually the first question you want to ask is, well, how much do you need and how are you going to pay it back? And actually sometimes there's a gap in between being able to answer those questions. So thinking in your instance, Jason, thinking back to the time you took your first investment, was it an easy decision to come to have that discussion with the board? You've touched on it in your presentation, and in terms of getting comfortable with risk yourself, what the sort of things you were thinking about?
Good question. I suppose everyone was wanting, as I said earlier on, just the magic check, because it's easy then, isn't it?
Yeah. Free money is good.
Yeah, but actually, by the board of trustees recognising that the only way to unlock the future investment was to take on some form of loan finance, it forced that sort of financial discipline with all the trustees. So it wasn't just the trustee with responsibility for finance. The whole board then had to come together and explore, well, what does that mean to us? What are the risks? Bearing in mind, we've been losing money for the last few years. Now we're taking on loan finance, we're signing up to that. Well, we're taking it out at a higher interest rate because there was less security needed. So there was a greater risk, maybe for CIS.
Sure.
But what we did is made sure that the board of trustees and the senior leadership team and the employees all understood why we were doing it. So that when CIS engaged with us, it wasn't just about investing in some group of trustees or a business plan. Actually invested in the people, because they could see that there's a sense of belief and determination, but also a clear plan of how it was going to be repaid back through growing the business. So yeah, there were trustees who were anxious. You know, £500,000 of debt when you only got £1 million of income a year. That's scary, and very, very scary. However, I think what really drove everyone is this realization: if we stay where we are, the inevitable conclusion is closure. So we need to take some risk, and we need to step off the map of the known world into something unknown. But we need to do that in a way where everybody's coming with us, rather than a few people are left back at the home camp thinking, well, just see how you get on. And I think that's the challenge early on. So we did that with the trustees, and we did it with the employees, but we also did it with the family members whose sons or daughters we support, because there's inherent risk. Because what happens if it doesn't pay off, and we get the £500,000 from you and the grant, but we raise no more? But it came down to everyone really understood why we existed. And that belief and that determination to make it work was the real driver. And people thought, well, actually, we need to take some risk, because it's a greater risk doing nothing.
Yeah. And that's certainly something, Laura, that you covered within your presentation, thinking about risk-taking and doing nothing. And actually, it's a separate issue, but there's been lots of discussion about use of reserves. And we've gone through all the different kind of like forms of reserves and how we can articulate them. But as boards, over the past 18 months, we've had these discussions about what the appropriate form of risk is. And there's a kind of school of thought, I guess, in terms of charity wanting to almost do itself out of business because it's reached its full social impact. And that's a key driver. Balanced with the issue that Jason spoke about, thinking about actually, if you do nothing, you won't exist. So as a board of directors, it can be hard to balance that out and think, actually, what is the best decision in terms of taking some risk, which might put us in potentially a risky financial situation. It's taking on debt, but it might mean that actually our social impact and our social purpose is extinct.
Yeah, and I think that it is back to what I was saying earlier about thinking about the situation that the charity is in at that point in time, and thinking about maybe how it needs to change, adapt, do whatever to really support its beneficiaries in the way that its beneficiaries need at that time. I think what Jason spoke about there was very powerful in terms of talking about the fact that everyone had the same vision. There was a real common sense that everyone wanted to be able to move forward to ensure that the organization was able to survive for the very people that it was set up, for in the first place. And having that shared passion, that shared commitment actually is a huge part of, I think, what it takes to kind of take the step off the diving board sometimes. Yeah. Sometimes I think if your heart's not in it, if you don't really fully believe in it, you'll never do it. And I think, it's not just talking about charity decisions. That's what we're all like in life, quite frankly. If your heart isn't in something, you'll never really push yourself forward. But if you really believe in something and you believe that the decision that you're potentially facing is the right one for the organization, it's really the only option that you have to enable yourself to survive. That has to be the way that you move forward. And that's why, for me, it does come right back to, just that basic of acting in the interest of the charity is going to always mean different things at different times. Sometimes it does involve taking some pretty big decisions, and some decisions that really are pretty scary. When you talk about them in the way that Jason did there, the £500,000, it's kind of a wee bit sink or swim kind of feeling, I guess, in some ways. But actually, the choice potentially otherwise is closure or ceasing, and that's a far harder prospect quite often, I would say.
Jason, yeah.
So just add a little bit onto that, because Scott made reference earlier on to about professional advice, because just thinking back to that time, there was a realization, well, we don't have all the skills on the board. So we need to identify what the gaps are, and we need to commit to paying for that. Again, it's difficult when you look in the cupboard and it's bare, but it's amazing you find ways to find money when you realise that it's the only way to move forward. And as a consequence, we engage a whole range of people, which created probably some concern and anxiety on the board. We've now got a pretty top class VAT expert came in. So in Scots, I'm thinking, I remember that conversation. And actually, I quite enjoyed it, learning about, not that I'm interested in VAT, but I enjoyed working with all these new people because you start to learn a whole raft of new skills. It's exciting.
Yeah.
We had legal expert, we had financial expert, we had a fundraising expert come in. And all these people came together, and what it created was that sense of, oh my goodness, this is happening, but equally, oh my goodness, I don't know very much. And the trustees feel in like that, but actually collectively, it brought about strength because you realized that you were filling all the gaps in knowledge and skill. And therefore, when you did step off the map or the diving board, you were doing that as one group with your advisors and supporters, but with a common sense of, we know where we're heading to. We've got some idea how we're going to do it, but we've got some advisors along the way. But you know what? We know where we're going to. And that's the exciting thing. You said earlier on about my own personal, I think you made reference to how I felt.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I found it quite exciting in a way because it felt like it was a real business rather than a charity that just got money off people. And I think it gives us the credibility to be able to go and negotiate with funders who had been underpaying us for years, but also go out to potential investors.
And know about the full costs.
Yeah, so it was good.
We've got a question from Claire there, Richie. Hi, Claire. What's your question?
Am I off mute? Yeah. I was just wondering how your opinion or your view would change depending on the sources of income that the charity gets. So if the charity is wholly dependent on grants versus having a trading income, how does that affect your risk appetite or your decision-making process?
In terms of social investment?
No, yes, in terms of taking out a loan.
Yeah, I mean, basically you need to be trading in order to take out a loan. Obviously, I can't think of any grant funders, even if it's unrestricted funding, that they would be happy to pay for a loan. So that's, you'd have to have a situation, as you understand, that an organisation, would be trading, have a certain amount of income that is its own. I mean, so the question there, if you think about a mortgage, or if you think about any sort of loan or debt situation you get into, we will only invest in situations where there's a very strong likelihood we're going to get our money back. So that's basically, one of the assessments. The other huge one is obviously around about social impact, and that will weigh in the favour of thinking about it's a really socially impactful organisation. But ultimately, there's a kind of a decision round about basically credit worthiness, and in terms of basically how much debt it is it's appropriate to provide an organisation. It'd be inappropriate, obviously, to provide an organisation that wasn't trading to a certain level or didn't have the capacity to trade to a certain level, X amount of a loan. So it's not, to be honest with you, like so I've worked in this field within fundraising for social enterprises and also now in investment, and we see a range of models where you might have a model that's kind of 90% trading, and that's fine, but it's quite unusual actually. Usually we'll have models where you have an organisation that's trading X amount, and you'll have X amount of grant funding, and actually you'll have contracts from these different local authorities. And I guess it's a bit of accountancy actually. It's about being transparent about how much of that money is, we went back to unrestricted money there, it's about your earned income, how much of that could service debt.
Yeah.
But there's no favourable ability. It's not, we're a fan of working with grant funders, and actually I think going forward, we've been having a lot of conversation with all of the major grant funders in Scotland about basically what the future of the third sector looks like, and where we can support as grant funders and as investors in developing more trading models. If you have further questions, I sent a link there with some ways to get in touch with us and my email address. We're absolutely always delighted to speak to anyone about their social enterprises and charities, and we're always delighted to see if we can offer any support in any ways. So we're just coming up to the final few minutes at the moment. I just want to give my colleagues on call a minute or two to provide any kind of closing thoughts or closing remarks, and then we will wish you good day and say, get in touch with us if you want any further support. So Jason, Laura, Scott, any kind of final reflections on the session today?
Well, I just think one of the things that, sorry, just going to say from Jason's point, sort of the words I note down was financial discipline. You must have said it on several occasions, and that sort of it rings true from the messages I was trying to give. The fact that if you get your records in order, you get your finances in order, and you have a plan, I think that's a good starting and building block. And as trustees, it makes life easier to grow your charity, to see what happens by having that proper plan, have the accurate information to make the decisions, and get that professional advice. And the world's your oyster.
Good advice there, I think. And Jason, you were going to comment.
Yeah, I would just say that I suppose it's not forgetting that whilst there's a charitable purpose, it's only realised if the business is sound.
Absolutely.
And that I think was what I picked up at that very early stage when I arrived here, is that if we didn't get that right, the whole sense of why we existed for the last 40 years would be lost. And it's okay to talk in terms of business and making a surplus and investing and borrowing as a charity, because you need that to realise the purposes of the charity. And I think you just got to get people on board and understand that.
Surplus is an okay word. Laura, what are your final kind of thoughts?
I think the final thing I would say, and I'm saying this very much from the regulator's perspective, but sometimes taking a risk is actually the most responsible thing that you can do. And I think charity trustees sometimes just need to kind of just remember that it's okay, not to have everything that's completely certain all the time. Sometimes, as I say, taking a risk is the best thing that you can possibly do.
Perfect. I think that's a great way to end today's session. I'd like to say thank you to all of my speakers today. Thank you to Jason, thanks to Laura and to Scott, and thanks to the team at SCBO for hosting this and organising it today. As we said, all of the panel members here are on board to provide charities and social enterprises with support of many forms, if it's in the support of OSCR or from Johnston Carmichael, and also obviously we can speak to you about social investments. So thank you today, and hopefully see you again very soon. Thanks.